Questions to the Prime Minister. Graham Morris.
Question number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his answer, but I think we should also congratulate Team GB on its tremendous success at the recent Winter Olympics. Mr. Speaker, this week HSBC announced staff bonuses of £2.3 billion and a 140% pay rise to its chief executive. When ordinary British families face a cost of living crisis and too many young people languish on the dole, isn't it time for this government to listen to Labour and tax bank bonuses to get our young people back to work?
Well, first of all, let me join the honourable gentleman in congratulating Team GB for the best medal performance since 1924 at a Winter Games. It was a huge honour to welcome them to Downing Street, where I had an explanation of the tasks of skeleton bobsleighing and indeed curling, but I think our congratulations go to everyone involved and all those who helped to train them. On the issue of bank bonuses, they are well down from the appalling situation that was left by the last Labour government. But what we need to see is the proper control of all forms of pay and bonuses. What I don't want to see, and what I think we'd get from the party opposite, is focusing only on bonuses, because of course you can claw back a bonus, you can't claw back pay. And we don't want to go back to the days of Fred Goodwin, where you could be paid well for an appalling performance.
Does the Prime Minister recognise that it's part of the job of church leaders to challenge governments about poverty? But will he discuss with them measures which can help people out of poverty, like the pupil premium, like cutting tax on low pay, like measures to help troubled families? Because there is nothing particularly moral about pouring even more borrowed money into systems which can trap people in poverty and trap them in dependence on state.
I think my right honourable friend, who's a distinguished churchman himself, talks perfect sense. There is nothing moral about running up huge deficits, about out-of-control welfare bills, and if we don't deal with these problems, the whole country will be poorer. And I think we should listen to the words of George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who said this: the churches should beware of the dangers of blithely defending a gargantuan welfare budget that every serious politician would cut as a matter of economic common sense. Well, I think serious politicians have to engage in this, and that should go for everybody.
Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I join my honourable friend and the Prime Minister in congratulating Team GB on a brilliant performance at the Winter Olympics. As the immediate threat of floods passes, there are still thousands out of their homes, parts of the Somerset levels are still underwater, and hundreds of businesses and farms are still struggling to recover. Now, the Committee on Climate Change, the House of Commons Library and the UK Statistics Authority have all now said that government investment in flood defences has fallen. In the light of this and the events we've seen, does the Prime Minister think it's right to revisit the plans for investment in flood defences?
Well, we will look very carefully at the plans for flood defences, but of course we've set out spending figures all the way out to 2020, not all of which are fully committed, which are major investments in flood defences. But as I said 2 weeks ago, as the waters reside and as the EA and others can look at what happened, we can review and see what new measures might be necessary. But let me just repeat the point that in this 4-year period, and indeed in this Parliament, overall spending on flood defences has gone up.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that the figures the Prime Minister is quoting are phony, and I believe he knows it. This is what the UK Statistics Authority says. I know they don't want to hear it. They say this: government funding for flood defences was lower in both nominal and real terms during the current spending period than during the last. And the only way you claim otherwise is by ignoring inflation and claiming credit for the money that other organisations other than government spend. Why doesn't the Prime Minister admit it? They've cut flood defence spending and he's been caught out.
The fact is, if you take the period 2010, when I became Prime Minister, to 2014, the spending has been £2.4 billion, more than the £2.2 billion in the previous 4 years. If you take the 5-year period of this Parliament, all of which, during which I will be Prime Minister, the spending is higher than the previous 5 years. Those are the facts. But I have to say to him, I think having this debate is slightly pointless. The whole country should be coming together to deal with flood defences. And the fact is, from the moment that he turned up in a flooded village with a Labour candidate alongside him, he's completely misjudged the mood of the country.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say to him that if it's a simple choice between the UK Statistics Authority and him, people will believe the UK Statistics Authority and what is happening. And now, the assessment of how much to invest in flood defence depends significantly on your assessment of the risks posed by man-made climate change. Now, he said in opposition about climate change this: it's easy to do the softer things, like ride your bike, visit glaciers, and rebuild your house to make it green. That was him that said it. But it's only clear you mean it when you do the tough things as well, like telling the truth about climate change. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the truth about climate change?
The truth about climate change is this government has a programme to reduce carbon right across our economy. And we started with the government itself. Compared with the government he left in 2010 when he was Climate Change Secretary, the government's own carbon emissions are down 14%. But the point, let me just return to this issue of flood defence spending, because I think the people of this country will want to know this. He is committed to a zero-based spending review. That it means, yes we are, says the Shadow Chancellor, in an unusually helpful intervention. That means a zero-based spending review means they cannot pledge to match the flood spending we're making in 2016, in 2017, in 2018, or all the way to 2020. They have absolutely no guarantee to the people of this country they will take either climate change seriously or flood defences seriously.
Mr. Speaker, what total nonsense, and he knows it. Now, it's very interesting. It's very interesting because someone who in opposition wanted to talk as much as he could about climate change now is desperate to get off the subject. I asked him a question. Will he just set out for his party and for the country his views about man-made climate change?
I believe man-made climate change is one of the most serious threats that this country and this world faces. And that is why we have the world's first green investment bank here in Britain. That is why, unlike 13 wasted years of Labour, we're building the first nuclear power station for 30 years in our country. That is why we've cut carbon emissions emitted by the government by 14% since we came to office. That is why we've set out year after year carbon budgets in this country. They talk a good game about it, but it actually takes people to come in, govern effectively and deal with it.
Excellent. We're getting somewhere. Well, I agree with what he said about the importance of climate change. But the reason this matters is because there are people in the most important positions in his government going around questioning climate change. This is what the Environment Secretary says, and I quote, "People get very emotional about this. People should just accept the climate's been changing for centuries," and he refuses to be briefed on climate change. And the Energy Minister, when asked about climate change, said this: "You're not going to draw me on that. I haven't had time to get into the climate change debate." He's the Energy Minister, Mr. Speaker. So will the Prime Minister now clarify, is he happy to have climate change deniers in his government?
This obviously, Mr. Speaker, is the new approach to Prime Minister's questions. You come to the House of Commons and praise the Prime Minister for his commitment to climate change and the environment. I like the new style. I thought I might miss Punch and Judy. I think this is much more refreshing. This government has a solid track record of cutting carbon, of negotiating internationally, of investing in nuclear, the biggest renewable energy programme that we've seen in our country's history. For the first time in a long time, we're on track to meet our renewable targets. Perhaps you'd like to get up again and congratulate me for this excellent record on the environment. The whole country will have heard
he cannot answer the question about whether you need to believe in man-made climate change to be part of his government. He's gone from thinking it was a basic part of his credo to it being a matter of individual conscience. It used to be the thing he claimed was his passion above all else. And here's the thing, if we're to properly protect the British...
Order! The questions and the answers will be heard however long it takes, so those who are exercising their vocal cords in a rather excessive way really ought to calm down. There's quite a long way to go. Ed Miliband.
And here's the thing, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to properly protect the British people against the threats they face, we cannot have doubt and confusion in his government on the issue of climate change. Doesn't he need to rediscover the courage of his past convictions and tell his party to get real on climate change?
You can measure the courage of the convictions by the acts in government, the Green Investment Bank, the cuts in carbon, the investment in renewables, the investment in nuclear. He talks a good game, but he actually didn't achieve anything when he was in office. And Mr. Speaker, the most serious form of denial we have today in British politics is the reality deniers of the party opposite. What is their plan for the deficit? Nothing. What is their plan for welfare reform? Nothing. What is their plan for long-term investment? Because that is what climate change requires. Long-term investment like high-speed rail, long-term investment like nuclear power, long-term investment like fixing our economy. That is what this government is doing. All he does is get up and deliver a lot of hot air.
Number 3, sir. Can I ask my right honourable friend if he can turn to public concern at work, whether he could get advice on the Whistleblowing Commission report led by Sir Anthony Hooper, which included Michael Woodford, the whistleblower at Olympus, and see whether he could bring together people in government who can consider their recommendations and how we can stop people like Dr. Kim Holt being persecuted before the Baby P case and others which I won't mention now.
Well, I'm grateful for my honourable friend's question. As he knows, the Public Interest Disclosure Act 1988 protects most workers from being unfairly dismissed by their employer when they've reported a matter of concern, when they have blown the whistle. Now, we've strengthened the protections through the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act 2013. We'll always back whistleblowers when challenging poor standards, particularly in large organisations. But I'm very happy to make sure that he discusses with the relevant government ministers, probably the Minister for Government Policy, any further steps we need to take in this direction.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, does the Prime Minister get the depth of the hurt among victims' families and the deep sense of public outrage right across the country as a result of the outcome of the Downey case? He needs to understand that for an official letter, a letter signed by an official, to trump due process and the courts of this land without any parliamentary, legislative or statutory underpinning is deeply offensive to the public in this country. Will he now scrap these get-out-of-jail-free letters immediately? And will he do everything in his power to reverse the despicable decision in the Downey case so that justice can be done for the families of the bereaved?
Well, first of all, let me say I completely understand the depth of anger and concern that people will feel right across this country about the appalling events that happened in 1982 and the fact that the person responsible is now not going to be appropriately tried. Of course, that is absolutely shocking, and our first thought should be with those 11 soldiers and their families and their friends. It may have happened 32 years ago, but anyone who's lost someone in a situation like that will mourn them today as if it happened yesterday. And we should be absolutely clear, the man should never have received the letter that he received in Downey. It was a dreadful mistake, and a mistake that we now need to have a rapid factual review to make sure this cannot happen again. But whatever happens, we have to stick to the principle that we are a country and a government under the rule of law.
Lorraine Fulbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has taken swift action to help flood-hit communities, and I welcome the £10 million relief fund for farmers. The Grade 1 farmland in the Alt-Crossens Basin is at risk from Environment Agency scaremongering to reduce land drainage and close pumping stations. In light of recent events, can my right honourable friend reassure the growers in my constituency that the necessary protections will be given to their land, and that as well as being able to react swiftly, this government is planning for the long-term security of this profitable industry?
I think my honourable friend makes an important point. I'm glad that she is advertising to her farmers the availability of this £10 million fund that I hope will be useful for those that have lost productive land because it's been underwater for so long. The point she makes about farmers and landowners and others being nervous about dredging and draining their land because of EA rules is a good one. As I've said before, I think the pendulum swung too far against dredging, and that needs to change, and that will change. It is not the only answer or the whole answer to the problems that she discusses, but it does have a proper part in properly managing the landscape.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, the tragic death on a Birmingham street of Sarah Childs devastated her family and shocked the community. A much-loved sister and daughter, she was killed, and her sister Claire, pregnant, was severely injured by a speeding driver doing 64 miles an hour who got but 4 years in prison. Does the Prime Minister agree that the time has come to look again at the sentencing of those who kill with a car?
Well, first of all, my heart goes out to his constituent and the family of the constituent who tragedy was killed in this incident. I do think it's right to look again at the motoring offences and the penalties that are given. I've discussed this issue with the Secretary of State for Justice, who's already made some proposals and changes in this area, and I'm sure he'll be listening carefully to what the honourable gentleman has said.
Charlotte Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The response of NHS Wales to Sir Bruce Keogh's email recommending a Keogh-style investigation into Welsh hospitals of concern was that NHS Wales would only respond to legitimate concerns. Is the Prime Minister as astounded as I am that NHS Wales thinks that the Chief Medical Director of England and now the Royal College of Surgeons' views are not legitimate? And will he work with the Leader of the Opposition to try to persuade him to get his party in Wales to reverse this terrible decision and do an investigation into Welsh hospitals which could save lives?
I think the Honourable Lady makes a very important point. Sir Bruce Keogh's views should be respected and listened to by the NHS in Wales, and I particularly think the point she makes about the Royal College of Surgeons and what they've said today, what they're saying effectively is there are people on NHS waiting lists who are dying in Wales because the waiting lists are too long and because the NHS isn't being properly managed, properly funded and properly reformed in Wales. That is a matter for the Labour Welsh Assembly government, and they need to get their act together.
Dame Tessa Jowl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister accept the overwhelming humanitarian case for guaranteeing long-term support to victims and survivors of terrorism? And if so, will he agree to meet with me, Colin Parry, and survivors of the 7/7 London bombings who have benefited from the services of Survivors for Peace programme, which is now faced with imminent closure? And in doing so, will he remember his pledge that survivors of terrorism must know that they always have the support of the whole country?
Well, first of all, can I commend the Right Honourable Lady for the extraordinary work that she did in government and continues to do in opposition in helping the survivors of terrorist attacks, particularly the dreadful attacks that took place in London. I've seen it firsthand, the experience and the brilliant touch that she brings to this important work. I'm very happy to have the meetings that she discussed. In terms of the Survivors for Peace Foundation, it is a unique charity. It does an extraordinary job in supporting victims and families. I'm going to be discussing its future with the Honourable Member for Warrington South as well. Obviously, we want to make sure that all these institutions can continue their excellent work, and I'm happy to hold those discussions with her and, as I said, with my honourable friend.
Julian Smith.
Mr. Speaker, we all want to see a more balanced economy. Does the Prime Minister agree that today's stonking upward rise in business investment, over 9%, shows that British business, British entrepreneurs are really rising to this challenge?
I think my honourable friend makes an important point. right across this House, and many experts have been saying what we need is a balanced recovery, one that sees increases in exports as well as increases in consumption, one that sees increases in investment from business, and the uprating of the figures today, the GDP figures showing an increase in exports, and, as he says, a very large increase in business investment is hugely welcome for our country.
Ms. Margaret Ritchie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given yesterday's court revelations of a secret scheme, does the Prime Minister believe that, as well as the parties in Northern Ireland progressing the elements dealing with the past from the Haas talks, that there is a need for transparency from the two governments regarding the confused and shabby ways in which they sought to deal with the past since the agreement, remembering that Downing Street was involved in this matter?
Well, first of all, I agree with her that the Haas talks made some good progress. They were trying to deal with some of the most difficult issues in Northern Ireland in terms of flags and parades, and perhaps the most difficult issue of all, the past. It's going to take a lot of courage and bravery from people on all sides in order to make progress in this way. She wants to point the finger, apparently, particularly at Downing Street. I would argue that when it's come to dealing with things like the Bloody Sunday inquiry, dealing with the De Silva report, that Downing Street is very happy to play its role in helping to bring parties together and make sure that we continue with peace in Northern Ireland.
Mr. Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, given what the Prime Minister has called the Leader of the Opposition's new approach and Chancellor Angela Merkel's forthcoming visit tomorrow, does he think there's something we can learn from her about an even broader-based approach to coalition building which would unite the whole country? Because while it's true that under such circumstances he'd have to give some red meat to them and some red meat to us, it would have the huge advantage for all of us of leaving the Liberal Democrats where they belong.
My admiration for Angela Merkel is enormous, but and there are many things that she's achieved that I would like to copy, not least getting re-elected. But one thing I do not want to copy is I think the idea of a grand coalition is a bit too much for me.
Mr. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps will the Prime Minister and Government take to insist that the National Crime Agency assist the People Trafficking Act Northern Ireland in cooperation with the PSNI? And can he give an assurance that those involved in criminality in Northern Ireland will not be in possession of a letter that is their passport to freedom, ever mindful that the National Crime Agency don't have free rein in Northern Ireland?
Now, well, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point. I've been very impressed by the work the National Crime Agency is now doing. I think it's a huge improvement on its predecessor. I think it has got real strength and heft and numbers in terms of being able to tackle organised crime. And I think it is bad for Northern Ireland that the NCA is not able to properly operate there. I hope that over time, with talks between the parties, it will be possible to make progress. It would be good for Northern Ireland and good for our fight against organised crime.
Nadine Dorries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I take this opportunity to congratulate you on your new role as Chancellor of Bedfordshire University. Mr. Speaker. In the last 3 years, 99 brave soldiers have given their life for this country in Afghanistan. In the same period of time, 264 women, British women, have been murdered at the hands of murder perpetrated by men, and over 3/4 of those women were stalked before they were murdered. Would the Prime Minister please give a guarantee that this government will introduce legislation to protect women from that fate in the future, particularly given the ease now that stalkers have to begin their stalking activity via social media and the internet?
Well, I'm very grateful for what my honourable friend says, and she's right that stalking is an appalling crime. It can destroy lives, and we need to do as much as we can to crack down on it. We have, of course, introduced a new offence to make absolutely clear the view that we take of it. The new stalking laws are also equally applicable to online cyber stalking and harassment, and the Crown Prosecution Service has published guidelines for involving communication sent via social media. So we tackle this in the online world as well as in the physical world. But I'm very happy to write to her with the detail of all the things that we're doing and see if there's further steps we can take.
Helen Jones.
When the Prime Minister was asked about the bedroom tax last March, he said, "What we have done is to exempt disabled people who need an extra room." Now that we know that people with terminal illness who can't share a room, those who have to store equipment such as dialysis machines, and families with severely disabled children who need occasional respite are all subject to this pernicious tax, would he like to revise that answer and to apologise to the disabled people to whom he gave false hope?
Well, first of all, let me repeat, this is a basic issue of fairness, that people who are renting in the private sector do not get additional money for rooms that they do not use, and so it's not fair to have a different set of rules to the social sector. But we also have a large discretionary payment system in order to help families like the ones that she mentions.
Jessica Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the increase in jobs, or stonking increase in jobs, in the private sector is leading the UK's economic recovery and helped, if I may say so, by the range of engineers, manufacturers and retailers in Erewash who are employing people and sending their exports around the world?
I think the Honourable Lady, my own friend, is absolutely right. We've now got 1.6 million new private sector jobs, meaning that there are 1.3 million more people employed in our country. We're seeing that growth in employment in every region in the country. Some are growing faster than others, and we need to keep up the work to make sure this is a broadly balanced recovery. But one of the indicators of economic success is week in, week out, the leader of the Labour Party comes to the House of Commons and cannot mention employment. He can't talk about the economy. He can't talk about jobs and investment and growth, because all the things he said would never are in our economy.
Michael Connaughty.
Could the Prime Minister focus on the fact that Atos now want to give up their contract for the work capability test? Is it not time to change the test back to one based upon the medical evidence of the consultants of those who are applying, when 158,000 appeals are upheld? Surely it's time for him also to rescind his decision to charge people for appeals.
Well, first of all, I hope it's not too uncharitable to point out that the Atos contract was actually awarded by the last Labour government. And of course, we are now discussing and debating with the company how this should be taken forward. But the fact is, we do need in this country a way of determining whether people are fit for work or not. And when it comes also to the issue of sanctions in our benefit system, frankly, it is right that people who are offered a job and don't take a job do now face a sanction. And I think that will be the choice at the next election. One party in favour of hard-working people, another party obsessed by bigger and bigger benefits.
Sir Bob Russell.
Britain's armed forces are the best. They defend our interests at home and overseas, and as we are witnessing, taking essential action in flooded areas. Prime Minister, please recognise the folly of reducing the size of Her Majesty's armed forces and stop sacking full-time servicemen and women.
Well, first of all, this gives me the opportunity of praising the extraordinary role that armed services personnel have played during the floods in our country over the past few weeks. It's been extraordinary to see their work. What we have done in terms of defence is remove the £38 billion black hole that we were left. Now, of course, that meant taking difficult decisions, including difficult decisions over the size of the Army, Navy and Air Force. But what we now have is a top 5 defence budget in terms of spending anywhere in the world. We're coming to the end of all the redundancy schemes, so we can now point loudly and proudly to the extraordinary investment that we'll be making in Type 45 destroyers, in new aircraft carriers, in our hunter-killer submarines, in our A400M aircraft, in the best equipment that any armed forces could have anywhere in the world.
Diana Berger.
Speaker, yesterday I met Billy. He's 24 years old and he's worked since he was 15 until he lost his job a year ago. Billy told me that he had to resort to going through supermarket skips to find out-of-date food just so he could eat. Prime Minister, Billy is desperate to work. Why won't the Prime Minister offer him a jobs guarantee rather than him having to scavenge in Iceland's bins for food?
Well, what we are doing for Billy and for thousands like him is offering jobs and hope that simply weren't there under the last Labour government. You know, honourable members opposite come here week after week to try and say that this country is somehow poorer or worse off under this government. Let me remind her what it was like in 2009. In 2009, there were 1 million more people in poverty, 500,000 more children in poverty, 150,000 more unemployed people, and 750,000 more people claiming benefit in 2009 than there were today. So yes, there's more to do, but we've got a proud record of giving people jobs and hope because we're sticking to a long-term economic plan.
Mr. Speaker, just over a week ago, I joined Year 5 and 6 pupils at Revel Primary School at Monks Kirby in my constituency, and I asked them what they would like to ask the Prime Minister. And one of them said to me he'd like to know why the government keeps on making so many new laws. So I wonder if the Prime Minister could tell my young constituent what his administration is doing to reduce the burden of legislation.
I think he's got a promising future in this place. That's the sort of attitude that we need. And I would say to his constituent, through him, that this is going to be the first government since the war that leaves office at the end of its term with fewer regulations in place than at the beginning. And that is because of the excellent work of the Business Department and the Honourable Member for West Dorset, who've done a brilliant job at taking regulation off business so we can create the wealth and jobs that we need.
In Wally.
The Prime Minister will know the disappointment that there hasn't been an oral statement to the House about the future of Stafford Hospital, given that it is expected that the University Hospital of North Staffordshire will take on the whole running of the combined sites for the people of North Staffordshire. Will he accept that at the last count there was a funding gap of £39 million capital costs, £4 million revenue costs, and make sure that whatever the new arrangements are, there will be opportunity to question the government and that these changes will not go through at the expense of the health of the people in North Staffordshire?
Well, what I can say to the Honourable Lady is a written statement is being made today about the future of the Stafford Hospital. It's been a very difficult issue to try and deal with the appalling situation that we were left in terms of Stafford Hospital. I'm sure there'll be opportunities to debate in this House, but I think she'll see that what's being proposed are good steps to make sure that A&E continues at Stafford Hospital, and hard work to be put in to see that if it is possible in the future to make sure we continue with consultant-led maternity services so people can go on having their babies delivered in Stafford Hospital. That is what I want to see. That my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will be setting out his proposals later, and I'm sure there'll be many opportunities to debate them and indeed all the lessons that need to be learnt from the failure of Stafford Hospital in the past.
Mr. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, millions of Londoners were inconvenienced by the pointless underground strike, which was only supported by 30% of the union members. Will my right honourable friend agree to conduct a review to increase the threshold so that pointless strikes in our public services are outlawed?
No, well, I absolutely think my honourable friend makes a good point. I think when you see how many people rely on these essential public services, the time has come to look at what changes we can make to see if it is possible to see fewer of these strikes in future. I think one of the problems we've also seen is, in spite repeated requests, the party opposite have completely refused to condemn what was a totally unnecessary strike. But I don't think we should be surprised, because this weekend they're all going on a cosy weekend with their trade union masters. We were told, Mr. Speaker, they were heading for divorce. I think they're going to renew their vows.
Order.